like fruit flies in the breeze. Ill at ease. We try so hard to fight it, but we can't change the way the wind blows. Can't find a way back home. We can't change the way the wind blows. No, we can't find a way back home. And while we try to sleep, forgotten dreams, they beg of us to count them, so we back and forth with the sheep. On cloudy coats they gleam. How we bleed, afraid to up and wander, let the wolf get.
Welcome everyone to our April lecture on the ancient roots of alchemy, and a warm welcome back to our longtime member since the 1990s, our program officer and guest speaker today, Dr. Holly Fincher. A native of Southern California, she lives now in a farmhouse in rural New Hampshire with a flock of sheep and 3 border collies. Her topic today is based on an Arabic copy of an ancient Greek manuscript, an alchemical text by Zosimos of Panopolis of the 3rd to 4th century CE, called the Book of Pictures. It illustrates how to deal with the collective unconscious and offers useful psychological insights that can benefit people today. And so we welcome back to our fold, Dr. Holly Fincher.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am excited to present today a subject that has been with me since I first became aware of it in about 2007, which I will tell you a little bit about in a moment here. First, let me share my screen so that we can get oriented. No, that's not what I wanted.
That's good.
Okay, good. Okay, so we are here today to talk about the Book of Pictures by Zosimos of Panopolis. And I have 2 quick things I want to point out that will help orient us with regards to some of the things that some of the language I'm going to use and some of the things I say. This first slide here is a portion of a papyrus picture from the Amduat, which is one of the Egyptian books of the dead. And I chose this picture specifically because in the center top portion there, you see the 2 eyes looking out at the viewer. The one eye represents the solar eye, the eye of what is known, the eye of consciousness. And the other eye represents the lunar eye, or what is not known, or what we would say is the eye that has the vision towards the unconscious. And when we see these 2 eyes together, of course, as all mammals have vision with these 2 eyes, it is a 2-oneness. So we see that we need a vision for, according to the mythology, consciousness and the unconscious, that we have a whole vision. And I wanted also to draw our attention to this few lines, these few lines from C.G. Jung, where he talks about what is reality anyhow. He says, anything that we can know of the world in either the physical or the spiritual sense is psychic. Everything known is filtered through the psyche. It is psychified. The very fact that we know something, anything at all, is grounded in the being of the psyche. We simply have one psychic world of images with two labels, physical in origin and spiritual in origin, whose reality, however, is purely psychic. I really like this passage, which was recently pointed out to me by a colleague, because it really helps to give the sense that each of our own inner reality filters everything. What we are aware of consciousness and our own unconscious influences filters everything that we know, how we know it, how we perceive it. And that's incredibly important, especially when we consider what it is when we encounter other people. They have that for themselves too. So I want to try to change. Okay, now I think I'm in the right spot. Okay. So today's presentation is in 3 parts. The first is an introduction, or what I say is the solar eye vision, and the mythic background for the material, the lunar eye vision. Part 2, I'm going to look at a selection of pictures from the Book of Pictures and try to explain as best I can how I understand them using psychological language. And part 3, I will try to conclude by explaining how I think that these pictures inform us about how to go forward living in our times, how this document is somehow relevant and useful for us today. So in this way, this presentation is itself a two-oneness. The first part, the introduction about what is known, it is the solar eye of knowledge, and it contains information to help us become oriented. But the rest of the paper is the symbolic lunar eye, and it is an expression of my individual attempt to discover a myth about the reality of the living objective psyche, which we also refer to as the collective unconscious. It is my way, this presentation, of trying to create new wine in new bottles, distilled from the roots of my own Christian heritage. The Mushaf as-suwar, or Book of Pictures, is a symbolic alchemical text attributed to Zosimos of Panopolis. Zosimos was an Egyptian who lived at the convergence of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Like others of his time, he wrote in ancient Greek, and therefore his alchemical texts are considered Greek alchemy. He is considered to likely be the first known Greek alchemist, though alchemy has roots in ritual chemical practices that can be traced to a kind of proto-alchemy found as far back as ancient Sumer. But I understand the idea of symbolic alchemy best when I consider how it is the compensatory knowledge that counterbalances our Christian era in the West. So when we think of alchemy, a lot of common thoughts are that, oh, well, they were trying to turn base metals into gold. But really, it is an ancient art that consisted of a chemical practice in which a symbolic ritual knowledge was also taking place. So today we can loosely think that alchemy evolved into chemistry on the one hand, and depth psychology, or this, what we would say, anything having to do with the unconscious and the objective psyche on the other hand. According to the literature, Given the period in which Zosimos lived, he would most likely have been familiar with the Pharaonic tradition, the Egyptian and Greco-Roman mysteries, as well as the then emergent Christianity, because he was surrounded by it, and it was the heritage of his roots. The Greek alchemical text called the Book of Pictures by Zosimos of Panopolis is known by scholars, but only fragments of the original, that is the primary source, have been found. The Mushaf as-suwar is dated to 1211 current era, and it is an almost complete Arabic copy created some 900 years after the Greek manuscript. Following its rediscovery for the West in 1988, the document was translated from ancient Arabic into English language over a course of 25 years, and an introduction copy was published in 2007 by the Jungian analyst Theodor Abt, followed by the complete manuscript copy in 2011. As a more intact copy, much closer to the primary source when compared to later Latin versions, such as the Rosarium Philosophorum and the Modus Liber, the importance of the Book of Pictures cannot be underestimated. It is a rare document. In a way, we can say that it strengthens the link between the ancient roots of Western culture, reaching far back into Pharaonic Egypt through Zosimos, as a first symbolic alchemist, with the depth psychology of today found in the psychology of C.G. Jung. A more complete and reliable copy, this Arabic copy retains the element of the depiction of the human being, and it shows how this aspect, the human being, is directly involved in, or we could say the subject of, the process of alchemical work. Over time, as copies passed through the centuries, the human being present in the symbolic work is mostly, if not completely, lost. This is why Latin alchemy is so strange and greatly unrelatable, because it only depicts the archetypal elements which are remote from human consciousness and which do not provide the human ingredient necessary for the distillation of experience and the concomitant suffering of life into meaning. So let me just show some slides that show some photographs of pictures from the Book of Pictures. You can get an introductory sense here. And this picture, I think we see how the woman clothed in yellow has two left hands, and the man on the right has two right hands. This has something to do with this better known picture from the Rosarium Philosophorum, where they greet with left hands. And here is another picture from the Book of Pictures. And here is the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is long since published and written about. And here is a very archetypal depiction, and another one, which in a way is not very relatable. As we learned from Jung, the Latin alchemists did not have a lens of psychology through which to understand their alchemical experiences. They became mixed up and unable to get past a crude depiction of the hermaphrodite that does not yet transcend a mixture of opposites caught in a sexual depiction. It seems, however, that Jung himself was able to intuit a transcendent union of opposites hidden in the alchemical material as having something to do with human experience. For his essay entitled The Psychology of the Transference, this makes a successful leap into a deeper understanding of the so-called transference problem constellated in the relationship between two human beings. So let's go back. Here we have two human beings. And again, in this picture, the human being on the left and the archetypal energy dressed in the image of the human being on the right. About this, Jung says, the problem of the union of opposites had been lying there for centuries in its sexual form, yet it had to wait until scientific enlightenment and objectivity had advanced far enough for people to mention sexuality in scientific conversation. The sexuality of the unconscious was instantly taken with great seriousness and elevated to a sort of religious dogma, which has been fanatically defended right down to the present time. Such was the fascination emanating from those contents which had last been nurtured by the alchemists. The natural archetypes that underlie the mythologiums of incest, the hieros, the divine child, etc., blossomed forth in the age of science into the theory of infantile sexuality, perversions, and incest, while the conjunctio was rediscovered in the transference neuroses. So from Jung, we learn how the analytic relationship in which a so-called transference ensues, meaning where an intense unconscious dynamic between the two human beings becomes constellated. And this has the potential to result in the process of individuation for both persons potentially, if this so-called transference is not acted out literally, meaning if an attraction there is somehow not acted upon, but instead carefully and slowly understood psychically, meaning the distillation. It has been my personal experience that the vessel containing such a situation does not need to literally be a material container. So, what is the Book of Pictures? Literally, it is a book of pictures comprised of 3 sets of picture series, and it has an accompanying text that comprises a dialogue between a teacher, Zosimos, who we see depicted here on the right, and his student, Theosebea, who is standing center to the left. The book depicts a love story, that of a forbidden love between Zosimos and Theosebea. Caught in a compelling attraction with one another, their feelings remained unrequited, that is, not acted upon. The Book of Pictures is a set of images that together tells the story for how to sit with the attraction situation rising up in the body in literal human experience, and how to distill a spiritual meaning behind the presence of those emotions and feelings and urges. And through this process of distillation, give birth, symbolically speaking, to the individual self, or what we would call the eternal personality, by working it out symbolically and not acting it out literally. In addition, a corresponding parallel process on the transpersonal level, meaning in the objective psyche, can result in the transformation of the God image, or an unfolding of the self itself, we could say. The Book of Pictures is an essential depiction for how to work through psychological complexes to the extent that this involves integration of an opposite to the ego. So our ego is the identity, who I feel that I am, what I esteem myself to be, and the thoughts and feelings that I have to that end. And individuation involves adding all the rest to that, which might be positive or negative. So it's an expansion of the personality in a way which requires our ability to tolerate that expansion, which isn't as easy as it sounds. We could say the Book of Pictures is a depiction of the process of individuation according to the psychology of C.G. Jung. As told in the story, Zosimos says to Teosebea, "What I wrote to you and told you, and with the picture I made for you with me in it, I gave you what you need to know, and this should be enough for you." Because the dialogue between them goes back and forth, and she keeps asking him to tell her basically the meaning of life in a way. And he does not fall for that. He, in a way, responds always in a way which is causing her to have to discover that reality within herself. And he also says that the pictures depict his own inner psychic process of transformation. So he's showing her how to do it for herself. Now, psychologically speaking, to the extent that an image is itself a retort, meaning a vessel, the pictures in the Book of Pictures are themselves vessels for symbolic work. And this picture that we're looking at now, which I will go into detail a bit later, I refer back to it again and again. It is something to gaze upon and let it work on you as much as you work on it. The main theme of the work is essentially to sit with it and work it out, don't act it out. A line that my first analyst used to say to me again and again. But with the specific focus here on sexual attraction in the Book of Pictures, I myself would like to emphasize how sexual attraction, eros, and the love problem in general is a central focus that can be taken as the most fundamental kind of attraction of opposites. It is an attraction between the one and the other that in a way represents the problem of attraction between all opposites. In alchemy, the king and the queen, as masculine and feminine principles, represent all opposites because they are the most essential set of opposites. The Book of Pictures is not just a guide for the love problem. It may also be a guide for self-development in general. It illustrates the necessity of withdrawing projections to realize an inner symbolic reality of the projected content existing within oneself. So everything is psychified. I experience someone coming towards me. They represent something to me that's not familiar in my own reality. So I see something in them. I project something. It might be very positive. It might be very negative, or some combination therein. And what we're saying here is that the goal over time is to be able to realize that we are projecting. That's what it is to withdraw projection in a way, just to realize it. Now, regarding this picture, when looking at the picture from the standpoint of our ego consciousness, we see on the right side the picture of a man and a woman, Zosimos and Teosebea. They represent the essential set of opposites that, when united and reconciled, can produce a third new thing, a new contribution to the creation of consciousness. This reflects the problem of opposites in the lived life experience of our human bodies through the course of our mortal lifetimes, often experienced as a so-called love problem, like when we fall head over heels for another person, or we are basically in a state of unconscious projection onto the other. Now, on the left side of this picture, we see the alchemical oven, which would represent the symbolic counterpart to the lived life experience depicted on the right side of the picture. This left side oven is the symbolic life. It shows how the counterpart to the lived life experience is a symbolic distillation of that experience, a process that is possible when it is successfully contained inside the symbolic body of the oven. Taken together, The picture shows what is necessary for the creation of consciousness and the development of a meaningful life, one that is lived in this lifetime and also in tandem somehow with the infinite nature of the unconscious. It is the two oneness of the solar and lunar eyes that together form one vision. Now, I once heard a story about how in 1988, the Jungian analyst Theodor Abt obtained a facsimile copy of the Mushaf as-suwar as found in an Istanbul library. That's the book I showed you earlier. He brought this copy that he was able to get from that back to Switzerland and showed it to Marie-Louise von Franz, who was herself at that time interested in Arabic alchemy for its potential to provide the missing link between more ancient knowledge and later alchemical material. Now, when we keep in mind how Dr. von Franz was C.G. Jung's closest collaborator, especially with regard to his work on alchemy, and how her own life was devoted to understanding the meaning and importance of the human relationship with the objective psyche, we can ascertain how she would anticipate the importance of such a discovery. Now, we could say that alchemy is the Western way. It is a vessel, so to speak, as a myth for dealing with the objective psyche. Upon seeing the pictures, she is said to have remarked that the Book of Pictures is the most important document for humanity at this time in history. Now, upon pause, I think we have to take this comment from Dr. von Franz under serious consideration. I don't think she would make such a statement lightly. And it follows that we might not take it lightly in response. So ever since the first time I heard this story, it has lingered in my mind, in the back of my mind. Why is the Book of Pictures so very important? Now, personally, for me, it has been important in a variety of ways. It was the subject of the very first lecture I attended as a prospective student when I arrived at the training center in Switzerland early in 2007. It was the very first lecture was on the Book of Pictures. At that time, it had, and it continues to have, a profound and meaningful impact on my learning and understanding of Jung's psychology. And I find that fact interesting in and of itself, given how Jung did not know of the document, because this Arabic copy, which is relatively complete, it was not uncovered during his lifetime. The Book of Pictures has been a subject of study and included in the content of lecture material for me, off and on, since that first lecture in 2007. And it has accompanied me in my analytic practice, where a selection of the pictures has guided my work and also helped others to understand their inner psychological processes and goals. Still, however, it is one thing to take something on the wisdom and authority of another as a starting point, and yet another thing entirely to discover for oneself and to try to comprehend the fundamental meaning of an idea or a psychological reality. So this is the beginning inspiration for this creative project of mine, and an effort to understand what Dr. von Franz meant by her declaration, that this is the most important document for humanity at this time in history. So when I first started this project, I planned to try to elucidate a context for this viewpoint. However, one should be careful when they plan, because I must admit that while the initial idea for working on this came easily, I have found that the closer I have gotten to the material, the farther I find myself from it. The more I understand, the less I understand, and the more immense and deep going I find the encounter. Now, this tells us something about the Book of Pictures itself. The material seems to be dealing with vast impersonal processes, with the archetypal realm, somehow depicted in contact with consciousness, whether the human being is aware of this or not. Or it shows us how to be a human being in relationship with the archetypal realm as a living reality behind the experience of being human, without ourselves being overwhelmed and becoming disintegrated in the process. It seems to be a guidebook for how each individual can manage to be a vessel for the resurrecting archetype of eternal return. Confronted with the pain and anxiety that I experienced when I started this process of writing, and it meant that I had to find my way to a kind of periphery, to a basic outline of my own personal understanding. I don't think I can really say what the Book of Pictures is about, but I must try to discover my own individual sense of its meaning. In this way, this project became a kind of distillation of a personal myth for myself. So, shortly after I made these initial plans to deepen my work and started organizing thoughts for this lecture material, I had a brief dream in which I saw a simple hand-drawn picture of a falcon and a falconer. In retrospect, I realized how the dream picture was stylized as if it could be a part of the Book of Pictures. Here I show you that I made a picture of my dream, and it was so difficult to sketch something that, because I'm not very artistic, I first traced. So I had to trace to initially feel like it was good enough, and I had to work on it from there, which you will see in a little bit. So once I realized it was stylized like it could be from the Book of Pictures, this dream picture, I made an attempt at an initial amplification to try to realize a meaningful connection as a first step. I thought about the lines of the poem The Second Coming by Yeats, and this served as an initial personal association. So in this poem, we learn, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Of course, the emphasis here on the line that the falcon cannot hear the falconer, this emphasis is mine, for the way in which the traditional thought regarding this poem is that it carries a particular meaning. It is the observation that the human being, regarded as the falcon, no longer hears or is no longer obedient to his creator, the falconer. Now, we could say that man has lost his connection to his own instinct, to the way of knowing how he is part of nature, where nature in its essential aspect is the living objective psyche. Our Western age of enlightenment has taken us very far from our unconscious roots, a process which seems to have spread across almost all human experience. Humanity is no longer able, therefore, to listen to the wisdom of nature, the unconscious. Psychologically speaking, we would say that humanity has, at large, lost its connection to the collective unconscious and to the self as the guiding and centering principle. So this is how I initially approached the meaning of my dream. Humanity cannot hear the self, though I also had to realize that this aspect of the situation is already known. Of course, the ego knows what it knows. Therefore, this is not the meaning of the dream. And so I was further challenged with the task of trying my best to interpret my own dream. Of course, the falcon is Horus, son of Osiris, who becomes incarnated as the first pharaoh, so that henceforth the pharaoh is half human, half divine. The eye of Horus is the lunar eye, which I understand as the symbolic vision that sees and speaks in the language of the underworld, the collective unconscious, the eye that must be repeatedly renewed, so that a kind of evolution in the archetypal realm can take place as well as here in matter in our material life. The modern problems in our culture stem from an unraveling and loss of connection to the guidance and wisdom of the lunar eye that is the eye of Horus, the one who sees with the vision from the living objective psyche. This is a loss that we can also paradoxically conceive of as having a hidden intention, a telos, within or behind the zeitgeist, meaning the collective wind that we are carried upon. That we could also call the collective consciousness that unfolds out of an archetypal pattern itself. So there seems to be an archetypal pattern that takes us away from the unconscious in collectivity. In Jungian psychology, we have the idea that a process for the potential of renewal is taking place in which humanity is now in a kind of regression to a symbolic womb of rebirth. But before descending into the underworld to try to understand an underlying meaning of this in a mythic sense, there are still a few considerations regarding what is known by the solar eye that I would still like to consider. Symptoms on the collective level can be seen in the clash of opposites as found in 2 world wars over the last 100 years, and our more recent and present-day concerns also, such as the conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East. We also now have a kind of people's war on gender, or a mixture of opposites reminiscent of the medieval hermaphrodites. Of course, with that, sometimes it's the right thing, and other times it is just being literalized, what is meant symbolically. We have a continued frantic materialism where the self is concretized in matter, fundamentalism, and a general petrified one-sidedness that lacks the know-how and ability to become related to the other side, which is only part of itself. For example, in one example, mainstream psychology seems to ever more embrace the problem of pathological narcissism, described as a lack of an ability for insight and empathy in the individual. Psychology loves to categorize individuals this way, only then to hatefully reject them. This is also part of the mainstream dialogue now. But this further contributes to a one-sided view. Such an understanding is in service of furthering the split rather than realizing the positive or light side of the other within the vessel of our own reality, so that one can then become a vessel that holds the 2 sides together symbolically. Now, let me explain. This does not mean to condone unacceptable behavior or to embrace some kind of psychopathology in another person. What it means is to maybe you have to separate from that person. and shield yourself even, but you still have the responsibility to be a vessel yourself that can stand the tension by being aware of the two opposites together. It's, in a way, we could say, like holding oneself to a higher standard than just coping with trauma, or to be like what I said earlier about with everything being psychified, one has to realize that we are living in a psychic reality. Rational approaches do not work, nor is it healthy to assist an individual by helping them to adjust to the collective attitude that is making them sick in the first place. My own dreams really time and again warn me, do not take sides. They challenge me when I bump up against someone who I'm disappointed in, and I think, oh, you know, that person, they are very one-sided. And then I'll have a dream that will clearly show me the other side of that person. And then I have to realize that in the vessel of my own reality, that is also part of the picture, even if I never see it outside. Our collective symptoms can be understood as reflecting a continuing disintegration of religious institutions across the world that once served as collective containers and held and conveyed the underlying and living mythos for groups of people. In his autobiography, Jung explained, he says, our myth has become mute and gives no answers. And in another source, he goes on to say, the modern world is desacralized. That is why it is in crisis. It is no longer, nothing is sacred anymore. That was in 1952. Here we are 72 years later. It seems we are ever more in crisis as the circumstances continue to unravel. Large groups of people are taking to mass thinking, which is not really thinking at all. There is an absence of symbolic relatedness that we would say is an ability to think and know things symbolically. This seems to be widespread and overarching, so that even in the face of a simple, straightforward explanation, many, if not most people in general, cannot comprehend the symbolic. This is a problem that I think the Book of Pictures can help with, but only on the level of the individual. The desacralization of our times is one reason the ancient alchemical document is of utmost importance, because it links us with our mythopoeic roots, out of which a new myth for each individual can be distilled. If I understand Jung's psychology correctly, the direction such development stemming from the collective regression, the direction this can go, constructive or destructive, depends on the inclusion of consciousness or not. In the archetypal paradigm, the motif is changing from the era of the image of the two tethered fishes, or the problem of opposites that are inextricably linked to, and this is a problem of moving from one mythic paradigm to another, the water bearer. Where the human being is a vessel for containing the opposites in one wholeness, or we could say the mixed bag of knowing oneself psychologically through individuation. This shift in images as projected onto the cosmos could reflect a potential for an evolution in human consciousness, an evolution going from a necessary and natural split of opposites to a now differentiated and unified whole, a new kind of two-oneness held together in the vessel of the individual human being. For further exploration on this topic, you can read Jung's hypothesis in Ion, in which he shows how the archetypes express through the actions and fantasies of humanity towards their own unfolding transformation. Another source is his explanation in an interview given for Combat magazine, a French magazine. It was given just following the finished publication of Ion on Synchronicity and Answer to Job. And it can be found in the book entitled C.G. Jung Speaking. Here Jung states, modern man must rediscover a deeper source of his own spiritual life. To do this, he is obliged to struggle with evil, to confront his shadow, to integrate the devil. There is no other choice. That is why Yahweh, Job, Satan represent psychologically exemplary situations. They are like paradigms of the eternal human drama. Of course, he goes on, you can read it for yourself if you like, that to integrate the devil, he means to become aware of it, to include this also in the vessel of knowing, not to become identified with it. Those are two different things. Today, many, if not most human beings do not live close to the collective unconscious. They do not know their own shadow, and they have no relationship with it because our culture has no vessel, no myth or ritual process, no image within which to become related to it. Frankly, most people become irritated when the unconscious gets close, and they project any and all uncomfortable parts of themselves onto somebody else. I mean, that's human psychology, and we don't escape being human. But C.G. Jung's analytical psychology was a reopening of the innate human potential to relate to the unconscious, where his concept of the collective unconscious is a rediscovery of the living objective psyche for Western man. The Book of Pictures seems to be a guide for how to process one's experience symbolically rather than acting it out literally. It could be a key document, a guide, so to speak, for how to regain symbolic relatedness psychologically in our everyday lives, and therefore develop an ability to integrate the shadow, the task Jung emphasized as so important. It is a guide for how to once again live in accordance with the unconscious consciously. Here I am reminded of Jung's simple remark that he says, quote, people think they are living, but really they are being lived. Analysis can be a way to hold psychic contents and distill them symbolically. With her wisdom, Marie-Louise von Franz comprehended the nature of our collective situation, and she realized how the Book of Pictures is an ancient and yet relatively relatable document because the human element remains present in the alchemical depictions. It is a guide for every individual pertaining to how it is possible to be a vessel for containing the opposites in one wholeness, what today we can say is a kind of mixed bag of knowing oneself psychologically through individuation. But it is nothing short of a realization of the spiritual or archetypal meaning behind the great emotions of our lived life. Through Jung, we know that this individual process is the way that collective transformation takes place through a connection individually with the self. Humanity is at a stage in the long developing process of the evolution of human consciousness where our own individual egos are now capable of being a distillation apparatus in the vessel of our own individual bodies. It is not possible to accomplish this distillation by way of a group experience, where the individual identity is subsumed into the collective, and thus the possibility for the connection to the self is lost. This is why the importance of individual work was emphasized by Jung, and it refers to his statement that in working analytically on oneself, the individual is perhaps laying an infinitesimal grain in the scales of humanity's soul. So now, to conclude the introduction, The Book of Pictures is a deeply rooted depiction for how it is possible for the individual to become related to the problem of opposites within the vessel of their own human body. You don't need anything else but yourself. And through this symbolic process and reconciliation of opposites, give birth to the self, a process which has a corresponding effect upon the archetypal realm. On the individual level, this is the inner aspect Jung referred to as the number 2 personality, stemming from the unconscious, and it is the source of infallible guiding wisdom from within. On the collective level, this symbolic process taken psychologically is the key for how collective transformation can take place now, at this time of seemingly great transition during the evolution of human consciousness. The not yet understood problems that stem from the backdrop of the entirely unconscious archetypal realm, that is the psychoid realm Jung described as a limitless dimension of the psyche, not directly connected to consciousness. These not yet understood problems, they forge into humanity and they manifest on the level of collective problems. And when they're not understood, they come into family lines and are patterns there. And when not yet understood, they forge into the individual and ultimately manifest as personal problems. When we can work out an individual understanding of our own lived life experience, our own personal problems, when we can hold the tension of great emotion and search for the spiritual or archetypal meaning behind such emotion, then we can possibly contribute that grain towards the transformation of the archetypal process and thus the collective experience. Jung stressed the importance of the image as the interim. We meet the archetypal indirectly in the image. We must look towards the images that arise in each of us individually to find the archetypal patterns hidden in their meaning. So this ends the introduction of the solar eye, what is already known. I want to go back to that difficulty that I hinted at. At that time, I could feel in my body a definite sense that the material was wanting and working on me. And I knew I must deepen my approach and try to elucidate something for a deeper meaning. As it turns out, the lunar eye stepped in all by itself. Because when my self-doubt about this project reached its greatest intensity, when I knew that I, like my ego, really had nothing to say, I began having dreams that seemed related to the creative process that I was trying to get underway. At first, these dreams seemed to encourage me by compensating my low attitude. Over time, this unfolded into a dream series about the Book of Pictures itself, as if the unconscious was pointing me in a direction for the work. During this time, I experienced a nightly intensive on Zosimos' alchemy. When finally I was led down into Pharaonic mythology to the rebirth of Osiris in his son Horus, a deep insight hit me consciously, and then the dreams, they stopped. At least for a while, and I could foresee the rest of the creative project in my mind's eye. This informed me that I now understood enough consciously about the meaning of the Book of Pictures. So it's this dream series that informs my the rest of the material going forward, even if I do not cite those dreams and I don't overtly include them in the material. Let's go back to the dream that I did share. The dream of the falcon and falconer depicted as if a picture in the Book of Pictures. It seems an appropriate viewpoint to say that the unconscious is expressing something important, contributing to a greater understanding of this material, having something to do with the falcon, with what the falcon represents, and most importantly, what is behind the picture. an unknown psychic element expressed through the image of the falcon as a symbol. So first, we should start with some basic amplifications. Interestingly, falcons are considered different from other birds of prey because they kill with their beaks, not their talons. They can fly an estimated 100 to 250 miles per hour. Evidence shows that falconry most likely began in Mesopotamia roughly 2,500 years ago and was especially popular with European nobility during the Middle Ages. Falcons are special, considered different from other birds in general because of their trainability. Whereas symbolically speaking, birds are often taken to represent principles of spirit, falcons are closer to the human being because they are trainable. They represent an aspect of spirit that has the special nature to be in close relationship with consciousness and to work back and forth with it towards greater potential. The dream falcon could represent a kind of spiritual principle that is somehow transformed by contact with human consciousness and vice versa, both working together toward a greater goal. Perhaps the dream falcon represents that aspect of spirit that is the potential to be related to the human being, that is to be incarnated. The falconer with the outline of the human being could represent the human consciousness involved in this kind of two-oneness, falcon and falconer, spirit or archetype and human consciousness working together. While this is basically backwards, I admit, from the Yeats poem where the falcon was compared to the self, we should remember that the self takes the face of the human being on the individual level and often appears with a human guise on the divine level throughout Pharaonic mythology, where the falcon in either form can be the representation for the sky god Horus, also the first pharaoh. So I go with the paradox that as a symbol, it is both. Essentially, the image is a gestalt. This is the two-oneness. The sum, it's an image that where the meaning is greater than the sum of the parts. Trainability goes both ways. We humans must also train ourselves, and the two-oneness of the falcon and falconer represent the two eyes of the upper and lower worlds that work together for a complete vision. So now let's be reminded that according to the appearance of the dream, this all has something to do with the Book of Pictures. So my amplification as the falcon as the symbol of Horus elicited a greatly deepened sense of meaning surrounding this short dream. And through that, I think a deeper understanding about what is the underlying myth from the Book of Pictures, this emerged for me. So when I mentioned earlier that the dreams ceased, an aspect of the creative process that indicated to me somehow I understood enough about what the unconscious was saying, and this means that the dream points to the symbol of Horus and the overarching of the myth of Osiris as the dead and resurrecting god. For the dreams seemed to be pointing to this. And from here, more clarity emerged about how the Book of Pictures has the potential to be, or frankly, for me, it is nothing short of a link between the knowledge of our ancient past with the psychological reality of human experience today, and in this way, a kind of potential guide for how every individual can constructively reconnect with a mythos expressing humanity's deep-going roots as a source of all life and healing, without simultaneously being destroyed by their effects. From there, Within the vessel of one's own body, an individual myth can be distilled into a story about the meaning of one's life. Horus, the falcon-headed god, is the son of Isis and Osiris. He is the first pharaoh who incarnates in every human being. Therefore, Horus is a divine spirit who transcends into the human individual. He is the two oneness of the falcon and falconer, the eye of the moon and sun working together. Let's consider the symbol in context with the greater mythic story. And I want to be clear, at first in the myth, he incarnates in every pharaoh, and over time, he later becomes incarnated in every common human being. By understanding the myth, we can possibly trace the appearance of the spiritual meaning behind our lived life experience. According to Eliade's discussion of ancient Egypt in his study, A History of Religious Ideas, and with the psychological interpretation being mine, after the beginning emergence of a mound in the primordial waters, or an emergence out of the objective psyche, the pharaonic myth tells how the sky and earth united in a hieros gamos, a sacred ritual marriage, an absolute unknowable psychic mystery, from which the two couples, Osiris and Isis, and Set and Nephthys, are born. Here are spirit and matter, also masculine and feminine principles. They come together in a divine union, an event out of which a new dynamism emerges, the problem of opposites that leads to the archetypal pattern of creation and destruction and creation that can be conceptualized as eternal return. Each couple, Osiris and Isis and Set and Nephthys, are comprised of brother and sister, which can be understood as representing the inextricably linked nature of the masculine-feminine aspects of the archetypal spirit. They are each a two-oneness, and the two couples are also a two-oneness and a fourfold structure, psychologically pointing towards the self. In this cosmological configuration, Osiris is essentially a legendary king, famous for the energy and justice with which he governs Egypt. But of course, he's murdered by his envious and evil brother Set, showing how the two oneness has within itself the ending, death, and destruction of the original state, an ending necessary for a process to commence. About this aspect of the myth, Jung states, thus evil, as though cognizant of its imperfection, strives to be made perfect through rebirth. So we have a pattern showing how death, destruction, and suffering appear inherent in the process of renewal. The only pharaonic god who suffers a violent death, Osiris is cut into pieces by Set and scattered across the landscape. Isis finds him. She buries the pieces where they are found. This shows that the earth is fertilized, and Osiris, henceforth the green one, symbolizes sources of fecundity and growth. Out of the symbolic death and dismemberment comes new life. The earth, being fertilized, ensures the return and the ongoing life of the kingdom in the progeny. Even though his phallus is the one piece not found in the myth, because it was swallowed by a fish, Isis manages herself to become pregnant from the dead body. And here we see her in the form of a sparrow, I think it is. A bird. She copulates with the deceased Osiris. She manages to become pregnant from the dead body of Osiris in a complete mystery. And the state of death seems to be the source of new life. The phallus being eaten by the fish shows how the potency and fertility towards eternal return is assimilated into an additional symbol of renewal and rebirth. The fish is symbolically an autonomous content of the unconscious. It represents the unborn child or new potential and is a symbol for Christ. The fish is also man who exists in the psyche the way a fish exists in water. The motif of the fish swallowing the phallus of Osiris seems to indicate that the human being becomes the vessel in whom the potent phallic urge towards renewal and rebirth is situated. This part's really important. The phallic potency of Osiris is in the fish, also means that the two tethered fishes of the Piscan ion also probably contain this energy in their manifestation. And I would remind us that concupiscentia, sexuality with the heat turned way up, is also of the fish. This seems to indicate that the creative Osiran energy can possess a human being through sexuality until it can be understood for its spiritual dimension. The image of Christ as a fish carries within it the phallus of Osiris and all of the preceding implications therein. Isis is described as the black earth of Egypt. This is Isis. She is fecundity, fertility, mystery hidden in the unknown. That is the blackness and the symbolic womb of rebirth. This is the blackness. That is the energy that draws one towards the secret of the mysterium conjunctionis. The feminine principle of receptive dynamism in matter pairs with, indeed seeks the potency of the masculine principle that is its complementary spirit and inspirations. As human beings, we need to be aware of how both principles are in us, so to speak, that they want to enact concretely when they are charged and newly emergent. In their primordial drama, Isis and Osiris repeat the hieros gamos of the earth and sky, which created them. From this repetition, the next development can take place as Isis, the black earth, becomes the vessel for the resurrection and rebirth of Osiris in the form of their son Horus. Here, I can't stress enough how these are archetypal energies dressed, so to speak, in the clothing of the myth. Psychologically, this implies that they are potential energies that enter individuals and express towards the drama that is their trajectory and potential. Often, if not almost always, this expression has a tendency toward concrete realization. The archetype needs the instinct. It needs the human body, the rubedo, alchemically, to transform the negredo, the blackness, to the albedo, the whiteness that is like the blank canvas ready to be filled in new again. When initially constellated and concentrated, the archetype always wants to materialize concretely. After he is born, Horus battles the evil Set and then wakens and brings Osiris back to life. But also, he, Horus, is the resurrection of Osiris as his son. The renewal and prosperity of the kingdom is ensured through the myth of the murdered and resurrected god and his son. This is the Osiris-Horus pair that is a two-oneness. You can see it here. This is a corn mummy. It is Osiris in the sarcophagus with his phallus there. And he's made of corn to represent that fecundity and fertility. But of course, it is Horus. It's the new face, the identity in the sun. This is the two oneness of this motif. Eliade explains, death accomplishes passage from the sphere of the meaningless to the sphere of the meaningful. So more than prosperity, a mythic importance is placed on death so that incarnate life is transmuted, becomes a term. Eliade goes on, the tomb is the place where man's transfiguration is accomplished. And Osiris increasingly becomes the paradigmatic model, not only for the sovereigns, but for every individual. Through Horus, Osiris enters the pharaoh and eventually every individual human being. Horus is a symbol for the archetypal spirit incarnated in the human being in life, and as an archetypal pattern of the dead and resurrecting God, Osiris expresses into the individual human being in death. In pharaonic times, the myth functioned so that literal death was necessary along with the preservation of the body as the vessel that contained the unique individual identity. In the journey to the afterlife, the individual identity now present in a subtle body or Ba soul form transmutes to become Osiris John Smith or Osiris Sally Good or whatever, it's Osiris NN, where the tomb itself is the duat or the afterlife. Through the funeral rite, which included chemical practices in ritual form, a kind of proto-alchemy, one's soul joined into an eternal reality. A process initially reserved for royalty, this eternal life was available to all individuals by the late dynasties by way of the funeral rites. In later Egyptian and Greco-Roman mysteries, literal death became a symbolic death when the initiate emerged eternal in this lifetime. And with early Christian ideas, salvation was available to all through Christ, an all-important message extending the possibility of eternal life regardless of position, funeral monies, or privilege, meaning the common man was now included. There is more thought to this paradigm, and I will return to it a bit later. The third new thing, a divine spirit born from the Hieros, Horus becomes the first pharaoh, the royal human being in whom he incarnates, and is henceforth the role model for the renewal of every pharaoh, paired later with the sun god Re in the synthesis of Re Osiris. A pattern emerges out of the objective psyche in which the problem of opposites is created when the archetypal realm unites with the material. The emergent pattern has a creative aspect, the union of masculine and feminine, sun and moon, conscious and unconscious, can result in the creation of a third new thing, a potential for evolution in consciousness, along with a development in the archetypal realm. Now, biologically, we humans can never depart from the necessary sperm and ovum for the creation of the third new child, the new reality, symbolically indicating a new development in consciousness. In this way, masculine and feminine principles represent the most fundamental set of opposites. And as I said before, in a way, all opposites are reflected in them. Like the mound from the primordial waters, this seems to be a pattern rising out of the objective psyche. Isis and Osiris are said to have mated in their mother's womb. It seems that the sexual motif is inextricably linked to the evolution of consciousness, and the importance of understanding the spiritual dimension of this cannot be underestimated. The union of conscious with unconscious needs to be achieved for a renewal of both. Here we have an age-old myth that, along with other tributaries, naturally unfolds through time into Western civilization. It is the key for understanding how mankind is incarnated by something transpersonal. And it reminds me of the passage in Jung's autobiography in which he states, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. So what he means there, if we understand the spiritual reality or the archetypal reality and meaning behind those fixings or fixations, we could say, this is what's important. The Book of Pictures can be thought of as a guide for how the individual can meet this transpersonal Osirian drama and deal with its personal effects that fuse and become confused with the natural bodily urge towards human reproduction and continuation of the species. For Zosimos, Theosebea was the black earth. Let me go back to the picture. She was his moon queen, and he managed somehow to resist acting upon this attractivity, and through a process involving suffering, discover the spiritual meaning behind the experience. The pictures drawn are a depiction of this process, which results in the birth of the self, according to how we can understand them based on Jung's psychology. For Theosebea, it would be the reciprocal experience. Zosimos was her sun king, or we could say the Osiris-Horus paradigm. If we can gain enough consciousness in relationship to this kind of process, we have the advantage that the development can potentially unfold in a constructive way in both personal and transpersonal realms. This is essentially why we are here, according to Jung's hypothesis. But if it remains unconscious to the ego, the danger of the autonomous nature of the archetype can prevail. It can prevail in a destructive way, and the potential for development is passed on to the next generation. The goal is to somehow break free from the material experience of being human and give birth to the symbolic body as Osiris resurrects through us. In this way, every urge that is filled with attractions toward another person or thing has behind it the archetype of eternal return. This archetype is expressing in the human being with an intention towards its own renewal and a concomitant possibility for the transmutation of the individual soul based on the incarnation of the individual. In the individual, that's the Horus factor, that results in an aspect of the individual soul or creation of the subtle body, the psychological reality of being connected to something infinite, to the objective psyche. Sometimes it has helped me to think of this as that the more one works on dreams, the more one becomes familiar with and knows the objective psyche. And then the more one is known by the objective psyche, meaning that some aspect of the individual as if, quote unquote, exists there. The attraction that compels us does not have to be solely erotic or sexual. It can be an attraction toward anything, according to the unique nature of the individual and what catches the projections. People are attracted to another person, maybe a pet animal or a material object or other situation, and they feel that they need that person, animal, object, or situation in a way that may be irrational at best. This can be understood as the longing for connection with humanity's deep-going roots as the source of all life and healing. Thus, the need can be experienced as necessary, entitled, this is how the ego feels, or as a kind of desire or desperation, even towards mere existence. In our current desacralized times, people are as if filled or stuffed with desire for sex, or maybe just to be sexy, the way our whole collective culture is sexualized in the West. Or such desire goes towards material objects so that their ego can exist the way a dear teddy bear is filled with or stuffed with fluffy, white, lifeless filling. Until the spiritual dimension of the experience successfully makes contact with consciousness, until it is understood enough so that the divine is separated from the mortal, such a pattern can and will have an endless effect. One is never satisfied. Moreover, it should be noted that Osiris does not wait for our attention before beginning renewal. The drama turns in an eternal return, whether or not we are aware or ready or able even to cope adequately with it, and whether or not it wants to become conscious. When not understood and therefore not related to, we are filled with meaninglessness. The archetype will express through the human being in the form of an autonomous complex, that's to the detriment of the individual's spiritual or physical material life, usually both. The stuffing of collectivism continuously filling the bear. To this end, that of the eternal nature of the archetype, our entire lifetime can be understood as a process of getting ready, working towards peeling apart the layers between material life experience and the spiritual meaning behind the experience, without falling apart in the process. So now I want to move to present a selection of pictures from the Book of Pictures and explain how I understand them psychologically. If we have enough time, I will also summarize some ways that this also comes into us and how the eternal drama of Isis and Osiris, a sexual drama of the spiritual realm, enters us through Horus, each of us individually in our material life experience. I hope to show how a strong enough vessel is needed, using the pictures, to distill the spiritual meaning out from behind these life experiences. So, I have a disclaimer, however, when we look at pictures, especially pictures from the unconscious, according to the method of C.G. Jung, we do not interpret them according to what we see in them. We do not use them like a projective indicator like the Rorschach. Instead, we have a carefully constructed method of amplification where we have to use all four functions and we have to carefully look at the picture and gently ask it to reveal its meaning to us. And we base that interpretation on tested age-old mythology and symbolism. It's very easy, for example, to look at the picture, say it reminds me of something, and while that's not to be thrown out with the bathwater, it has a meaning. It doesn't actually contribute. We don't say what the picture means from the outside in. We have to have a way to know from the inside out from the picture itself. In the Book of Pictures, I should note that some aspects of the pictures that are described in the accompanying text, while others are not. So, for example, there are mudras depicted in the hands that are not mentioned in the text. And so when something is not described in the text, I do not include it in the interpretation because I just don't know if it was added later by a copyist because we don't have the original primary source. So this is the first picture that I've chosen. It's the beginning of the work. We learn that they met, fell in love, and that this picture is the result of that situation. In this picture, Zosimos and Theosebea are smaller than the other figures. They're on the right there. This points to a diminished impact and agency of their conscious egos in this stage of the situation. They are wearing the sun and moon crowns, meaning they are in identification with the archetypal Sun King and Moon Queen. Theosebea is to Zosimos the black earth of Isis to Osiris. They are held in suspension by an overwhelming large figure of the spirit of the unconscious, here depicted as Hermes Trismegistus. It can be understood as a depiction of what it is to be in the grip of a complex. One is in a state of projection. The ego is flooded by an unconscious, psychified reality. This is a natural and regular phenomenon of human psychology when one does not realize consciously that they are creating their own reality by projecting unconscious contents onto the other. In this way, it is a kind of identification with the other that moves right along with being in identification with the crowned archetypes. Isis and Osiris enter. One of the first things I ever read about this state of being is the Book of Beauty by Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher who lived about 100 years or so before Zosimos. I refer back to it now because, as I understand it, he describes the state of falling in love, which is meant by the word beauty, as an early idea of projection. So Plotinus says, let us then go back to the beginning and determine what beauty or love is in bodily forms. Clearly, it is something detected at first glance, something that the soul, remembering, names, recognizes, gives welcome to, and in a way fuses with. When the soul falls in with ugliness, it shrinks back, repulses it, turns away from it as disagreeable and alien. We therefore suggest that the soul, being what it is and related to the reality above it, is delighted when it sees any signs of kinship or anything that is akin to itself, takes its own to itself, and is stirred to a new awareness of whence and what it really is. Understanding the psychology of complexes helps us to understand and think about how we are psychified. Later in the Book of Beauty, we learn from Plotinus that this projection can lead to a discovery of oneself, one's soul. However, for now, the animalistic sides, the instinct depicted in the other hand grip by the spirit of the unconscious, this aspect is bigger, it has more energy, and it is taking up more psychified space. We can think that there is an intentional hidden telos in this picture, but the outcome depends upon what happens next. In this picture, we see Zosimos as he instructs Theosebea. That is Zosimos in the center and Theosebea on the right. He instructs her about the containment of one's own personal bull. Here we can think about Osiris as the apis bull, or the bull nature, the containment of which pertains to a taming of or making conscious of the potent sexual instincts in order to discover the spiritual reality behind it. The red feet of Zosimos and Theosebea represent the standpoint in which consciousness is situated, the erotic passion of instinct, the fiery bull nature that can bring fertility or can bring havoc into your life. Red is the color that warms, but the fiery color that also can burn. There is a divine life providing quality of the bull energy, but it can manifest as overwhelming bodily drivenness, especially when the archetype is concentrated. It is paradoxically the human experience in living matter that is needed by the archetype to transform the blackness to the white. To do this, the inner bull nature needs to be consciously contained in the yellow vessel, where the yellow pertains to the constructive conscious realization. If not contained, the yellow can also be like a jaundice, the illness brought on destructively by the energy. This image seems to say that it is not okay to act it out. Perhaps this is easier to apply in other complex situations where the drivenness expresses in a non-sexual way, or perhaps not. It can be understood as a cultural problem of the zeitgeist, not understood and diving into the life of the individual, and then rationalized away as, oh, well, I can't help myself, or even because the culture, or especially because the culture condones it. Now we have some answers. Here we see how the body is in fact the alchemical oven. And I show you some later copies. So this is a copy, the Mushaf as-suwar is a copy much closer to the original source than the later Latin documents that we know. This is from the Mutis Liber, for example. But here, two human beings. The picture shows how psychic distillation, that is, symbolic thinking induced by holding back the instinctual impulse, the acting it out, while also maintaining a conscious awareness of it. No sweeping it under the rug. The symbolization is nurtured by pondering over the emergent energy and perhaps letting an image rise into the mind's eye. This must be a patient process, for unfolding through time is key to analytic work. We can't pull on plants to make them grow, and we can't condense an essence by turning up the heat and boiling the pot harder. The picture is a representation of the work it out, not act it out phase. I often tell people that the goal is to let an image arise in one's mind eye and engage that image further by making a picture of it. That's the beginning of making it symbolic. One can talk about how the fire goes in the oven at the bottom, how the oven has red feet just like Teosebea, though here hers are also blackened. The red is mixed with the black of unconsciousness, which can become constructive or destructive. And probably also we could say the black earth of Isis, who wants to become realized through her, is in her standpoint in consciousness. We can see how the heat rises upwards and the contents become sublimated through conscious understanding, psychological digestion, put into the boiling pot at top, and from here the insight can flow into the vessel and into her conscious awareness. So you see at the top, maybe my cursor can show this little receptacle vessel that has the transformed elixir, which is meaning, is being compared to her thinking cap. So it is also her psychological mindedness and awareness of herself, we could say. The body is the alchemical oven, and your life energy is the ingredient that can, indeed, needs to be distilled. This requires a patient process of letting the vapor rise and condense all on its own. Here, the elixir is meaning, the conscious realization of the archetypal energy in the backdrop of one's life and the ability to engage it through symbolic dialogue. Now, here we could also apply a kind of bell-shaped curve of human psychology. That is when anxiety ensues because something happened. Anxiety is a natural human response to the unknown, and it can lead to projection onto the other for alleviation. This is usually when we are confronted with the unknown, because one encounters another person that triggers a projection and thereby experiences discomfort brought on by the other as a result. But it's a problem of one's own creation. So usually on the bell-shaped curve, the anxiety begins to mount, and then before it can get any higher, we do something, we act it out, and that alleviates the anxiety, and it goes back to the starting point, recalibrates for the next time. Comes up, we do something, and then it comes back. But if we can sit with it and not act it out, that doing something is acting it out, we can sit with it, that bell-shaped curve of anxiety that we know through learning and behavior tells us that the anxiety reaches a plateau, and then guess what? It comes down the other side. That's the bell-shaped curve. That's how things like exposure therapy work. When you have some kind of phobia, you're afraid of a mouse, and so you step by step, you eventually touch a mouse, because the anxiety will plateau and go down rather than running away. And then it recalibrates to start over again. If one sits with it to work it out, not act it out, then the anxiety plateaus and eventually resolves. This is also true of the love problem. Often people in our Western culture will act upon the red feet, which means the archetype will only recalibrate and start over. The spiritual dimension will not be understood, though there can often be a personal perception of a kind of meaning. And here I refer back to the Syrian urge for renewal hidden in the situation. One might detect that they might feel that they need the other person in order to exist. But here we have to pull apart the layers of the onion and realize the paradox that also we need the continuity of the species. But it's when it's being acted out in a destructive way that we can look towards realizing that there is a spiritual dimension behind it that is not understood. I go on. Here, this is one of the final pictures of one of the 3 picture series. It is a depiction of the goal for Theosebea, although we are never finished with alchemical psychical work. On the left is the mortal Theosebea, clothed in red, showing that she is the human being with an instinctual lived life experience in the human body. She is the red needed by the archetypal realm. And looking at her face, we see that she suffers. On the right is the divine Theosebea, the eternal personality, clothed in golden yellow, the one we also call the subtle body or the self. Her expression is pleased. The unconscious has been able to unfold. However, we also see how the face on her moon crown mirrors the face of the mortal human being. So do you see here, the mortal woman suffers, and the face in the moon crown suffers too. This conveys a suffering inherent in the God image and could depict a kind of empathy out of the self. The picture is quite undoubtedly beautiful and usually has a meaningful impact on any person who sees it, in my experience. It shows the goal of individuation, the birth of the self in relationship to the individual human being. The tree of life grows between them. It is a picture healing in and of itself, one people do not soon forget, especially when it has been looked at and discussed in context with their own individual life experience. Now I have to skip a bit. I wanted to talk about, very briefly, some additional ways that I see this coming into individuals. The first example that comes to mind is the problem of what we call and know today as OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, where there is a biological illness affecting the individual, so much so that the ego, in a way, is really subject to another force, you could say. Obsessive compulsive disorder. The vessel is made fragile through this, and sometimes we could see an autonomous complex that presents itself in the obsession, a fantasy, and then the compulsion is the acting it out to try to cope with it. So this is an archetypal pattern. Often I've worked with individuals where there's a sexual content or theme in the obsession, like there's a sperm on my hand because I masturbated at night. And then during the day, I'm worried when I eat, it could get into my mouth. So my hands must be washed. But of course, this is the seed of Osiris. He wants to resurrect through this individual. In this case, the ego is not strong enough to contain it. The alchemical oven is too fragile. Or it could be a good pious day person, and at night a compulsive sexual encounter with a stranger or a prostitute, or acting on fantasies that are not understood for their symbolic reality. Whenever I have talked about this problem, it either, in consultation or maybe as examples to help other people understand their own situation, people are never surprised about that. It's really common, and people suffer dangerous circumstances as a result, like they can't help themselves. The opposites in the eternal drama are possessing the individual in that case. It's being acted out. Perhaps somebody has a stronger ego. They come to analysis, and the so-called analytic container. So the relationship with the other person creates a container. It's able to hold the tension. Perhaps an attraction arises, but it's not acted out. And then the spiritual side can develop versus it being acted out, because both people fall into an identification with the Sun Queen and the Moon, the Sun King and the Moon Queen, but they hold that tension in the analytic work. And then an image can arise, and from that, the possibility that the working with the dreams and so forth, that something of the spiritual reality behind it can be realized. Sometimes the individual just reaches a life stage of development, and they're simply ready now. Or perhaps they're encouraged along by the realization of that their method of coping isn't working, like there's an impending problem that's going to create a health problem or a situational problem, like one's physical health, one's mental health, one's financial health, one's relationship health. Some problem is looming. And often there could be some kind of fantasy, like that's forbidden and not understood. That is the archetype pressing and needing to be understood. Or there could be a compulsion towards something. People have compulsive affairs, compulsive shopping, all kinds of things. And it might even be so far weaved into the individual identity that the sense of it is simply as that's just how I am, while it slowly destroys from the inside out. Because when the archetype gets close, it can devour us. And we have to remember Jung's remark about how people think that they are living, but really they are being lived. A few more minutes, and then we'll finish for questions. When I was 5 years old, my mother helped me prepare for my first day of kindergarten through the pomp and circumstance of a weeks-long process of planning and preparing my clothing outfit. A pattern was picked out along with a selection of calico print fabrics done in browns and golds, and a special dress was sewn for me to start my first day of school with ceremony. It was my Heidi dress because it laced up a front bodice with a yoke at the collar and a ruffle at the skirt. And it was reminiscent of the dresses worn by Heidi characters in storybooks. My hair was braided and finished with ribbons, and my shoes and stockings fit to match. And the numinosity of this dress, it stays with me still today, mostly for the memory of the anticipatory feeling embedded within the experience of the dress itself, but also for the way in which my formal education began, with a telos hidden in the literal experience. Because, of course, it would be 50 years more before I would finish being a formal student in the pre-Alpine setting of Switzerland, where the legend of Heidi unites the modern world again with the natural man, with nature and the unconscious. Of course, this is an example, who is dreaming me? Who is dreaming any of us? Also significant was the fact that very soon into my school days I encountered a boy named Andy who lived one street over from me and who instantly became the focus of my crush fantasy. I recall one kindergarten day standing in the girls' line after recess and letting it slip that I like Andy. News soon traveled up the line and across to the boys' line, where a response then traveled back. That's okay, because I like her too. In that exact moment, my heart leapt into excitement and carried me into my very own soul existence, even though I had no real tangible relationship with him because I was 5. Andy was practically a numinous focus for me until the 2nd grade, when I turned 7 and it transferred to a Filipino boy named Henry. From there, a series of numinous encounters where I felt a deep meaning must be present in the other. This continued until I was married, an archetypal event itself that transferred me into a different kind of vessel. Looking back upon these personal experiences, one can readily see my life's story foretold. Isis and Osiris are dreaming me, resurrecting in me by way of the so-called love problem. In the early course of my life, my tendency to fall in love, combined with my ongoing love of clothes, having something to do with the desire of the Black earth, has at times preceded my own cognition. My task has been and continues to be one which seeks to understand this process in myself and to hold the spiritual reality of this situation in tandem with the reality of a real need for human intimacy and companionship, and also the way a woman relates to herself through her appearance and simple pleasure of wearing something nice. We are living in times when the primordial sexual drama, consisting of the eternal archetypal patterns that we may encounter dressed in the primordial myth of Isis and Osiris, eternal return, this is all mixed up, seemingly. The cultures of our societies no longer have containing vessels, as was the way in the past, when religions across humanity, by and large, served as such vessels. As Jung remarked, the world is desacralized this way. In the past, religion was the vessel that contained the individual in relationship to the divine. With the disintegration of such vessels, the archetypal drama floods into humanity, and the spiritual meaning behind the sexual reality is not understood. Everything, therefore, such as sexuality, gender, righteousness, the eternal, everything is understood concretely and mostly acted out literally. This is a lack of the symbolic way of knowing, a lacking which is replete throughout humanity. We don't have the vision of the two eyes yet again. In the West, sexuality tends to be celebrated without our awareness. It's the norm. We are too loose with it, so to speak. Often our fellow human beings towards the East reject us for this very problem, and they, on the other hand, seem to us too rigidly focused in response. A problem of opposites plays out between cultural groups because the spiritual or archetypal meaning behind the problem is not understood. It is projected onto the other where it remains stratified from its opposite. According to the development of ego consciousness, the individual now has the capacity to be its own vessel, which we see here depicted in this picture, for the incarnation of the archetypal. To be a vessel for the incarnation of the archetypal, each of us must work it out for ourselves symbolically. This is how we contribute to humanity's unfolding course. The collective problems of society, these not yet understood archetypal patterns, flow into family lines where they dwell, turning over upon themselves for generations. While not of an actively religious Christian household growing up, I am reminded of my Protestant ancestors whose lives were so pious in literalized ways, they were cut off from any integration, that conscious awareness of the dark side of the self, which invariably includes the body and sexuality, carnal life. Over centuries, the religious vessel was becoming petrified. This all or nothing quality then flows into individual lives where an all or nothing sexual experience may manifest, or it can be many other symptoms of the autonomous complex, which has at its core the spirit of eternal return. So with this, I hope I have been able to convey just the beginning of how the importance of Zosimos' work can be taken, how we can look at these pictures and just begin to get psychological relevancy with them today. I hope that the work of Zosimos is then again appreciated and that further interest and study of the Book of Pictures for both personal as well as collective relevance can ensue. Thank you. Judy, you are muted.
You're right, there I am. Thank you, thank you. That was very dense.
Yeah.
And so much meaning. I'm going to have to watch it again. But so much meaning, so much meaning. So we're close to the 2-hour mark, so I hope people can stay for a while so we can have some Q&A. I didn't want to cut this short. So whoops, I thought I saw a hand raised. No. So please use the raise hand function to ask a question or make a comment. And there we go, Janet Hartman-Jones.
Thank you so much. What a rich talk. I'm so glad you allowed it to be recorded. I want to go back and listen to it again. I don't know why this struck me so strongly, but from the time you showed the very first picture with the two figures and the alchemical vessel, I kept noticing that she had boots on, very heavy black and red boots, and he is barefooted. Could you comment just in that one little piece? Because it just grabbed me from the very beginning of your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way I'm pulling from memory here, it is not necessarily that they are boots. You are right, his feet are bare. Hers are colored red and blackened. Yeah. Yeah, so it's depicting that the redness is in the redness, which is the warm, fuzzy feelings,
Mhm.
for example, the red that is the blood in your lived life. This is what is her standpoint, so to speak, where she is situated. That it blackens now means that it regresses. She becomes regressed because the blackness is like the darkness that has the potential to give birth to the new. But it is also a darkness that can lead to destruction, just like the redness, the reddening here. It is possible that those warm, fuzzy feelings turn over into a fire that burns a person up.
Mhm.
And of course, there are also chemical meanings to the red and the black and the absence of the color and so forth. I mean, this is part of where it's just so vast and deep going. And there's parts that I don't understand at all because I don't have enough Egyptology background or chemical knowledge. My knowledge is psychological. Yeah, but it's one of the things where we also have to pay attention to what is written in the book and realize it's a copy. And so I feel very careful to say, for example, whether they're boots or not, unless it says in the text that she wears red boots and he is barefoot.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Paula, St. Marie.
Hi, that was very good, Holly. I really enjoyed that. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so thank you. So you said something about the archetypes want to incarnate. How do you see that? What do you see that as?
Yeah, I mean, this comes out of Jung's psychohistory hypothesis in Ion, where he talks about how the archetypal realm is completely part of the psychoid realm. It is the psychoid realm. It is unconscious. So it does not unfold through time and space because the psychoid realm would be limitless and timeless. And consciousness is bound to time and space. So he talks about how the archetype expresses through the actions and fantasies of humanity towards its own end, so that it can unfold through us.
Okay, yeah. So so even though that at some point you might have an unpleasant attraction to something that's very untimely and very inconvenient for your life trajectory, that to ignore it really won't work. Probably in the long run, it's going to come up in some other way. And the idea is to work with it and see what it wants to tell you, I guess is what you say. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That one can imagine oneself as a vessel, and if that attraction, this idea of sit with it and in order to work it out, then we try to let an image rise in our mind's eye. If we are overwhelmed with an emotion, if we can contain that, to be the vessel which is shown to us in that primary picture, this one that's on the cover of this particular publication. This picture that we saw, that we can contain it, then something can emerge symbolically.
So in life kind of today, it would be like if you see something on Instagram that really upsets you, instead of pushing the send button, you sit with it a few minutes, right? Or a length of time to let yourself know why you're having this kind of reaction. I think so many things are, for myself, I experience it as reactionary today. Goes with my own reactionary habit. But to sit with it, and like you said, an image comes up or an association to it or something, to see what it wants to say. Thank you. It was really good.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
You too.
Kurt Paddock.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Hi.
Okay, great. Well, this is more of an observation than a question, and I appreciate what you've said about not attributing meaning to various aspects of the symbol unless there was something in the text. But nevertheless, and I also think you mentioned mudras, hand gestures. It just strikes me in the one that you kept going back to most often, standing next to the anathor, the furnace, that reminds me so much of Maria Prophetessa, the early alchemist, and the notion that the one becomes two, that becomes the three, becomes the four, that in her hand, she's gesturing with one finger, and then he's responding with two fingers, and then she's holding up three fingers, and then he's holding up four fingers. It just reminded me of that particular alchemical maxim.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, undoubtedly there are threads that run through all of these, and it's possible that the original Greek text with pictures had these mudras or hand gestures present. But I don't know, so I feel very careful.
Right. Yeah, even if it wasn't in the original, it was perhaps in the mind of the Arabic transcriber that he by that time had picked up and seen the connection between the two.
Exactly. But then this is also like that old game of telephone from when we were kids. You know? I don't know what really came back from the boys' line, right?
Yeah, but I think it's inescapable that those mudras are there. And perhaps I'm attributing meaning to it that's not there, but it seems very coincidental to me that it's the one becoming the two, becoming a three, becoming a four, being encapsulating the whole alchemical process.
You're not wrong, but we have to tread very carefully in terms of, you know, the interpretation and the initial approach here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Lynn Parda.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to hear your really careful explanation of these things. And the elements that I'm interested just to mention has to do with you said that this book was found in 1988, I believe, but that I'm just mentioning in case you already know, but I was struck by the facts that they have discovered something that comes from probably what was known as the Atlantis that was on the delta of the Nile River, where they've been finding so many objects that do belong to this Egyptology. You probably know about that. There's a book, looking at the museum's depiction of the meaning of all this, is exactly the same story that you are telling. It is just extraordinary that all these things that you are describing about our mythological build, the system that is built to really develop within us, it's still going on, and it goes through and comes to connect so much again.
Yeah, I would explain it a little further. I didn't really get a chance in the preamble. I just wanted to kind of highlight how these discoveries, when we think about it, they are not very old. We have not had this knowledge for very long, and they are coming at the same time that the religious vessels are disintegrating. So, and of course, the myth is the mythos, it is the story underneath that becomes revealed when one layer, Nietzsche says God is dead. Of course, God didn't die. God has retreated to the womb where there's a potential new God image, which is a psychological term that can emerge. But in that process where where the current, let's say, Abrahamic religion mythos, the mythos out of that begins to fade away. Then what's beneath that, maybe we can connect with that, with a deeper root even somehow. I don't know.
I'm thinking a little bit too about this element that is, what does the Christ mean? That understanding of, again, where this sense of in the Christian evolving, that sense of we are integrated to become those who are the vessels, just as you're talking about.
Yeah, well, let me just say it here because it's part of what I skipped over in service of time. I'll tell you exactly what came to me. I say working on the material hasn't been easy, but it has been fruitful because I became cognizant of the symbol of Christ in a new way. The Christ myth shows us how it is possible for a common human being to withstand becoming incarnated by the Osiris-Horus mythos, a relationship between the archetypal eternal return held in a tension of relatedness to consciousness. The Christ myth shows that it happens in the course of regular life and also shows that suffering is inherent in this process because the suffering God enters the individual seeking its own transformation, and that this is how a connection to the eternal, the process of individuation, is achieved by the individual. I think up to this point, I only really ever had an intellectual idea about Christ, but if I could really digest the mythos, then I could see a kind of a thread. We have to remember that Jung says myth is the revelation of a divine life in man. It speaks to us a word of God. He says, God is not a myth. Myth is the revelation of a divine life in man.
Yeah.
And the Book of Pictures has the capacity for the individual to distill a personal myth. I mean, that's also what's happening when something you bump up against irritates you and you see it time and time again, and then you instead of responding, some people get hooked into the social media and they have to argue with people. Hold it, sit with it, let an image emerge, and if that image has some kind of age-old myth behind it, perhaps, or something, then you have a way to research and begin learning. This is one idea.
Thank you very, very much for that. Appreciated that.
Afton, Blake?
Yes, Afton. Wow, this was incredibly dense, and I look forward to going back over it. Very enriching, both personally and with my clients. I especially liked holding the sexual tension and turning it inward in order we could say to completely reach gestation in what it has to teach you. That was really beautiful. I love the image where you saw her still in pain, but her, what would you call it, the transfer had become peaceful and fulfilled, but still above her was the image with carrying the pain and the yearning, which I think is what would happen as we individuate more fully, seems. And lastly, your sharing of your own personal journey going into kindergarten. It brought back to me, even with all my therapy, memories of my own initiation into those first days of school. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I also live with several dogs, so very important.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's actually a really lovely way to end. There are no more raised hands. I think everybody is experiencing the same feeling of such richness that we need to watch this. I'm envisioning watching it and pausing it repeatedly to think about the things that you said and try to really, really absorb them and their meaning. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all at our May program, and have a lovely, lovely springtime. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.